Chapter 28 on the mechanism of identification and visualization. "Did you say pig or fig?" said the cat. "I said pig," replied Alice, "and I wish you wouldn't keep appearing and vanishing so suddenly. You make one quite giddy." "All right," said the cat, and this time it vanished quite slowly, beginning with the end of the tail and ending with the grin, which remained some time after the rest of it had gone. "Well, I've often seen a cat without a grin," thought Alice, "but a grin without a cat is the most curious thing I ever saw in my life." Lewis Carroll. The significance of the paradoxical phase is not limited to pathological states, such as those previously observed, and it is highly probable that it plays an important part in normal men too, who often are apt to be such more influenced by words than by the actual facts of the surrounding reality. Ivan Pavlov. In the case of an imbecile, repetition without comprehension, cynicism, may prevail. The role of visual impressions is null or nearly so among the illiterate. The deaf from birth who have learned to speak have no auditory impressions to intervene, but normally it is feelings and ideas that appear in action in the form of language. Henry Perron. The specific neurons necessary for sensation are also necessary for the associative reawakening of that sensation, which is called the image, a dynamic process and not a photographic negative resting miraculously in the nervous substance, where some subtle spirit might go to consult it. Henry Perron. It is nonetheless true that certain cultivated persons can use visual images and can even use these images in preference to others. Henry Perron. Okay. Objectification and visualization are usually not differentiated. The first represents a very undesirable semantic process, whereas the second, visualization, represents one of the most beneficial and efficient forms of human thought. From a non-Aristotelian point of view, such a lack of differentiation between the two reactions appears as a very serious problem, requiring an analysis of the respective mechanisms. To visualize, we must have such forms of representation as lend themselves to visualization. Otherwise, we must fail. The Aristotelian system, which could not adequately handle asymmetrical relations and could not be built explicitly on structure, necessarily involves identification. In the Aristotelian period, we were able to visualize objects in a few objective situations, but all the higher abstractions were, in principle, inaccessible to visualization, making scientific theories needlessly difficult. A non-Aristotelian system, free from identification, must be based explicitly on structure on all levels, structure defined in terms of relations and ultimately multidimensional order, which can be easily visualized. It should be recalled that structure, relations, and multidimensional order supply us with the language which completely bridges daily life experiences with all science, leading toward a general theory of values. Mathematics and mathematical physics then become the representatives and the foundations of all science. And in the human field, a general theory of values will lead to adjustment or sanity, will someday include ethics, economics, etc. For these reasons, the structural differential is uniquely useful, as at a glance it conveys to the eye structural differences between the world of the animal, the primitive man, and the infant, which, no matter how complex, is extremely simple in comparison with the world of the civilized adult. The first involves a one-valued orientation, which, if applied to the infinitely valued facts of life gives extremely inadequate, wasteful, and ultimately painful adjustment, where only the few strongest survive. The second involves infinitely valued orientation similar in structure to the actual empirical infinitely valued facts of life, allowing a one-to-one adjustment in evaluation with the facts in each individual case and producing a semantic flexibility necessary for adjustment. This flexibility is known to be the foundation for balanced semantic states, higher intelligence. Visualization requires a definite elimination through differentiation of harmful identification, which, as usual, is based on incorrect evaluation of structural issues. Thus, we have had endless, bitter, and futile arguments as to whether or not the mechanistic point of view of the world and ourselves is legitimate, adequate, etc. The average person, as well as the majority of philosophers, identifies mechanistic with machinistic. Roughly, mechanics is a name for a science which deals with dynamic manifestations on all levels. Thus, we have macroscopic classical mechanics, colloidal mechanics now being formulated, and the sub-microscopic quantum mechanics already being well-developed disciplines. In the rough, machine is a label applied to a man-made apparatus for the application or transformation of power. But even machines differ greatly. Thus, a dynamo is entirely different in principle, in theory, and in application from a lathe or an automobile. If we ask, is the machinistic point of view of the world justified? The answer is simply and undeniably, namely that this point of view is grossly inadequate and should be entirely abandoned. But it is not so with the mechanistic point of view understood in the modern sense and including the quantum mechanics point of view, which is entirely structural. In 1933, we know positively that even the gross macroscopic physico-chemical characteristics of everything we are dealing with depend on the sub-microscopic structure. See Part 10. The details are not yet fully known, but the principles are firmly established. With a non-Aristotelian understanding and evaluation of the unique importance of structure as the only possible content of knowledge, we firmly established principles become irreversibly established. We may go further and say that the quantum mechanics point of view becomes the first structurally correct point of view, and as such should be accepted fully in any sane orientation. If we stop identification, then we will differentiate between some simple facts. For instance, we will understand that any semantic state, reaction, or process has its corresponding sub-microscopic structural, colloidal, and ultimately quantum mechanical processes going on in the nervous system. However, the semantic reactions or feelings of pain or pleasure, etc., are not the sub-microscopic processes. These belong to different levels, but with infinitely valued semantics, we can establish in principle a one-to-one correspondence between them. Thus, when we differentiate adequately, the older machinistic objections disappear entirely, and in its proper field for structural reasons, we must preserve the mechanistic and entirely abandon the too crude machinistic attitudes. The mechanistic, 1933, attitude is based on structure and is so indispensable for visualization. And training in visualization automatically abolishes objectification, which represents an important special case of all identification. From the point of view of a non-Aristotelian system, adjustment and sanity in humans depend to a large extent on their understanding, which is entirely structural in character. Therefore, we must accept a mechanistic 1933 attitude, which, in the meantime, can be visualized. The finding of structural means of representation facilitates visualization, imagining, picturing, etc. in the adjustment trend We start with the lower nerve impressions, senses, feelings, lower abstractions, and these are abstracted again by the higher centers. The higher centers produce the very abstract theories which cannot be visualized for a while. The lower centers, which are involved in visualization, can deal only with structures which can be concretely pictured. So we always try to invent mechanistic or geometrical theories such as can be handled by the lower centers. Individual experiences supplied by the lower centers of different individuals do not blend directly. They're blended in the higher centers, in them manifold experiences, whether individual or accumulated by the race time binding, are abstracted further, integrated, and summarized. Once this has been accomplished, structural means are sought and discovered to translate these higher abstractions into lower, the only ones with which the lower centers can deal. Then we can visualize our theories, and the higher centers not only influence the lower centers, but the lower centers have appropriate means by which to cooperate with the higher centers in their new non-elementalistic quests. The lack of explicitly structural forms of representations is responsible also for the difficulties which arise when the higher order abstractions are translated into the reflex reactions of the lower centers, which can deal with intuitions, orientations, visualizations, etc. The so-called geniuses have a very subtle nervous system in which the translation of higher order abstractions into lower and vice versa is easily accomplished. From the point of view of forms or representations, we can have two issues. One, we may have elementalistic forms of representation which are not based on structure, visualization, and cannot efficiently affect the activities on the lower centers. Two, we may have a non-elementalistic system based on structure, visualization, which can be translated simply, easily, and efficiently into the terms of the lower centers. These problems are of educational importance and should be worked out more fully. In my experience with grown-ups who have had only a short contact with my work, I find in many cases that although they may have even given their complete verbal approval of the main point of the system, yet invariably in practice the full application is lacking. Obviously, the semantic importance of the present findings is not in the verbal approval alone, when that approval is not applied, but in the consistent and permanent instinctive acquisition of the new semantic attitude, which involves a complete elimination of identification, allness, elementalism. We can teach anyone to repeat verbally by heart instructions for operating an automobile, a piano, or a typewriter, but no one could operate them satisfactorily by reflex action after such verbal training alone. To operate effectively and skillfully any structural complex, we must become intimately familiar with its structural working through actual reflex training, and only then can we expect the best results. In my experience, this is true with language and without the visual structural differential on which we can point our finger to the objective level and urge silence. Such basic semantic reflex training cannot properly be given. If we ask a man, "Do you know how to drive a car?" and he answers yes, we assume that he has acquired the proper reflexes. If he answers no, but I know about it, he means that he has not acquired the proper reflexes, but that his knowledge is on purely verbal levels, non-effective in application or nonverbal reflex levels. This applies fully to semantic reactions. We may know about them, but we may never apply successively what we supposedly know. To know represents a multi-ordinal process which involves equally the activities of the lower nerve center and of the higher. In our elementalistic systems, we had no such distinction, and so we confused them. The older knowledge, when presented in elementalistic language could not have been absorbed easily by the non-elementalistic organism as a whole, as the main task at present is to unlearn the older semantic reaction. The new reactions need a persistent training, particularly by the grown-ups. The non-elementalistic non-Aristotelian language and method proved to have psychophysiological importance. Although the neurological mechanism underlying the identification, objectification, visualization, etc., is not well known, 1933, neurology gives us evidence that in these states, as well as in delusions and hallucinations, the actual lower nerve centers are somehow engaged. We may assume that different resistances, blockages, etc., in some parts of the nervous system make the passage of nervous impulses more difficult, and it seems reasonable to suppose that in such cases the paths traveled by the nervous currents are different. In Figure 1, a hypothetical and oversimplified scheme of the different types of distribution of nervous currents, as is known functionally, is suggested. The ordering is not anatomical but functional in terms of degrees of intensity. In this scheme, we may consider that the nervous impulse A reaches the lower nerve centers, the brain stem, and the thalamus, passes through the subcortical layers and the cortex, continuously being transformed. Finally, in returning, it may take either the beneficial and adaptive semantic form of visualization, B, free from identification and semantic disturbances, or may involve identification with semantic disturbances, such as objectifications of different orders, O, delusions, D, illusions, I, or finally hallucinations, H. Identification or confusion of orders of abstractions consists of erroneous evaluation. That which is going on inside of our skin has objective existence outside of our skins. The ascribing of external objectivity to words, the identification and value of memories of experiences with experience, the identification of our semantic reactions and states with words, the identification of inferences with descriptions, etc. Identification is greatly facilitated, if not actually induced, by the Aristotelian structure of language, in which we have one name for at least four entirely different entities. Thus, the Aristotelian apple, without subscripts and date, is used as a label for the physico-chemical process for an object, say, apple, February 23, 1933. For a mental picture on the unspeakable semantic level and for the verbal definition under such linguistic conditions, it is practically impossible, without special training, not to identify the four entirely different abstractions into one, with all the following sinister consequences. Delusions represent incorrect notions and inappropriate semantic reactions, formed not by insufficient knowledge or logic, but by affective pressure in a definite evaluation direction, as, for instance, delusions of grandeur, delusions of persecution, delusions of sin, delusions of reference, etc. Illusions appear more like real perceptions, but pathologically changed. For instance, anything may be semantically colored or interpreted or evaluated as an offense, or a threat, or a promise. Hallucinations consist of perceptions without all their vividness, but without any external stimuli. Patients hear voices, see visions, feel pricks or burnings, but there is nothing to hear or see or to be pricked by. In visualization, identification does not occur. Orders of abstractions are not confused. Semantic disturbances do not appear. The evaluation is correct. A picture is evaluated as a picture and not as events. In other words, because of the consciousness of abstracting, the natural order of evaluation is preserved. But once through identification, this natural order is reversed. It marks a pathological condition, more or less morbid and often of a non-adaptive character. Identification represents in affective tension the mildest semantic disturbance consisting of an error in meanings and evaluation. Objects are evaluated as events. Ideas or higher order abstractions are evaluated as objects, as experience as the unspeakable semantic states of reactions, otherwise as lower order abstractions. The confusion in the field of higher order abstractions follows a similar rule. Inferences obviously represent higher order abstractions than descriptions, so when they are not differentiated, higher order abstractions are again identified with the lower. We all know from daily life experience the fantastic amount of suffering we can and do actually produce for ourselves and others with such identifications. In delusions, a similar but more intense identification occurs, resulting in erroneous semantic evaluation. Wishes, feelings, and other semantic states inside of our skins are projected into the external world, giving delusionally strong objective evaluation. In illusions, we also ascribe to or identify our complex semantic states with different perceptions and evaluate our higher order abstractions as lower. In hallucinations, this process of reversing the natural order comes to a culminating point. Higher order abstractions are translated into and have the full vividness and reality of lower order abstractions. We see that the pathological processes of mental illnesses involving identification as a generalized symptom, which means the reversal in different degrees of the natural order of evaluation based on the intensified confusion of orders of abstractions. The more intense this process of reversal becomes, the more non-adaptive and morbid the manifestations. It should be noticed that this analysis becomes a necessity once we decide to accept a non-elementalistic language. This analysis is far from exhaustive, but an analysis in new non-elementalistic structurally correct terms throws a new light on both problems. Hallucinations which result from physical illness do not represent a permanent danger, but when a patient seems physically well and his confusion of orders of abstractions, delusions, illusions, and hallucinations become completely rationalized, then these are unmistakable signs of serious mental illness, suggesting submicroscopic colloidal lesions. Now, this rationalization represents nothing else but a nervous disturbance and involves identification somewhere. In physical ills, the nervous system may be disturbed, but the illness does not usually originate in nervous disturbances, and so, as such, is not dangerous. The distinction between visualization and objectification based on a non-Aristotelian system seems new. The difference is subtle, but when it is formulated, we can discover a simple means whereby to control the situation. If we were to take a bone made of paper mache and smear it with fat or meat, Fido would perhaps objectify or identify such a bone from the smell and the form of the paper mache with an edible one and would fight for it. We do a similar sort of thing when we objectify. Religious wars, the Holy Inquisition, the persecution of science, which we are witnessing even at the present day, 2025, in some countries and communities, are excellent examples. We should notice that Fido was able to trust his natural, even objectified instinct, for nature does not play such tricks on him, such as producing bones of paper mache. If nature did, dogs that objectify and persist in their liking for such food would soon be eliminated. These particular objectifications would be dangerous and painful to those particular kinds of dogs with that particular nervous system and would ultimately prove of no survival value. Thus, identification, which represents an inappropriate evaluation, is harmful to all life, but is little noticed at present because the main periods of the animal racial adjustment have been accomplished long ago. Experiments on flies show that the number of mutants which may be produced in a laboratory is large, but very few would survive outside of a laboratory. In unaided nature, these mutants probably occur but seldom leave observable traces. However, even today, as Pavlov has shown in his laboratories, we can impose by an interplay of a four-dimensional order of stimuli such conditions upon animals for which their nervous structural survival structure was not naturally adapted, and so induce nervous pathological states. Wrong evaluation is indeed harmful to all life and accounts for such rigid survival laws in nature, which science teaches humans how to make more flexible. Practically, word for word, this applies to ourselves. We are constantly producing more and more complex conditions of life, man-made, man-invented, and deceptive for the non-prepared. These new conditions are usually due to the application of the work of some genius in the nervous system and semantic reactions, and most of us are not prepared for such eventualities. In spite of inventions and discoveries of science, which are human achievements, we still preserve animalistic systems and doctrines which shape our semantic reactions. Hence, life becomes more strained and increasingly more unhappy, thereby multiplying the number of nervous breakdowns. It is known that not all people are able to visualize equally well. In the older days, this fact was taken for granted and did not suggest further analysis. Under present conditions in many human beings, and also in animals, as shown in the experiments of Pavlov, the visual stimuli are physiologically weaker than the auditory ones. In man, however, the visual stimuli should be physiologically stronger than the auditory. This difference does not affect the general mechanism of the cyclic nerve currents and order of abstractions. In the auditory type, the main returning currents are deviated into different paths. The division between visual and auditory types is not sharp. In life, we deal mainly with individuals who have no more than a special inclination for one or the other types of reaction. In the case of mental processes, human adjustment has to be managed on higher, more numerous, and more complex levels. Obviously, then the auditory types are more enmeshed by words, further removed from life than the visual ones, and so cannot be equally well adjusted. This fact should not be neglected, and on the human levels, we should have educational methods to train in visualization, which automatically eliminates identification. The auditory channels, which connect us with the external world, are much less subtle and effective than the visual ones. The eye is not merely a sense organ. Embryology shows that the eye is a part of the brain itself. And what is called the optic nerve must be considered not a nerve, but as a genuine nervous tract. The fact, of course, would assign to the eye a special semantic importance not shared with the other sense organs or receptors. We ought not to be surprised to find that the visual types are better adjusted to this world than the auditory types. In pathological states such as identifications, delusions, illusions, and hallucinations, there seems to be involved a translation of auditory semantic stimuli into visual images. In these pathological cases, the order of evaluation appears as label first and object next, while the adaptive order seems to require object first and label next. There seems little doubt that visualization is very useful and that identification is especially harmful. The most effective means to transform the semantic reactions of identification is found in visualization, which indicates its special semantic importance. The semantic disturbance of identification may have many sources, auditory included, but the only adaptive trend is in visualization, which involves in some way the optical neural structure. Some structural light is thrown on this subject, but when we realize that physiologically the eye is more closely related to the vegetative nervous system, which regulates our vital organs, than the ear is. In man, excuse me. In man, the optic thalamus is greatly enlarged so that the whole thalamus is often called the optic thalamus. Actually, the thalamus has many functions other than visual and is connected with affective manifestations. As most of our observations are accomplished by the aid of the eye, we should expect auditory types to be poor observers, and so racially, in the long run, not so well adjusted semantically. Observations show that the auditory types often have infantile reactions, a serious handicap. From an adaptive point of view, the normal, non-infantile, best adjusted individual ought to be a visual type. Auditory types must also be further detached from actualities than the visual types, as auditory stimuli involve more inferences than descriptions, which is the opposite of the functioning of the visual types. If inferences rather than descriptions are involved, we naturally deal with higher abstractions first and with lower next. And so there is always a danger of the semantic confusion of orders of abstractions, which necessarily involves inappropriate evaluation, of which objectification is only a particular case. Even to common sense, it seems clear that there is a significant difference between knowing this world by hearing and knowing it by seeing. There is likewise a difference between the translation of higher abstractions into lower terms by the visual path and the corresponding translation by the auditory path. In daily life, we never say, I hear, when we wish to convey that we understand, but we say, I see. When we say, I hear, we usually wish to convey that we have heard something which we did not fully grasp or approve. The above relation is rather important, but has not been sufficiently analyzed. The problems of introversion and extroversion are connected with it. The relation between the problems of identification and the number of values found in the empirical world in connection with the number of values ascribed or assumed by our semantic processes is most important. The following analysis is by necessity one-sided, oversimplified, as a fuller analysis would require a separate volume. I consider many problems in principle only. This allows me a briefer treatment necessary for my purpose, but it must be realized that our language and general semantics, which in practice we use unconsciously, are extremely complex and involve 1, 2, 3, and infinitely valued components, never as yet sharply differentiated nor formulated. Investigation shows that the infinitely valued semantics is the most general and includes the 1, 2, and few valued semantics as particular cases. The one-valued semantics of literal identifications are found only among animals, primitive people, infants, and the mentally ill, although more or less serious traces of some identification are found in practically all of us, because these are embodied in the structure of our language and prevent the acquisition of the infinitely valued systems necessary for sanity. For my purpose, it is enough to formulate the problems for the complete elimination of primitive identification, and then modern, infinitely valued, non-Aristotelian semantics follow automatically. Under such conditions, I must concentrate on the vital problem of one-valued identification and treat the two and few-valued systems sketchily in principle, although we must realize that the last systems have been made more flexible by the use of many ingenious verbal devices, which I do not even mention in the present work. Let me repeat that the attitudes, flexibility or fixity of our semantic reactions depend to a large extent on the structure of language used, which involves also its appropriate general semantics. The logic of our school days represents a composite affair in the main Aristotelian, and we call it by this last name. This logic can be considered as a two-valued logic because of the fundamental law of the excluded third, expressed as A is B or not B, by which a third possibility is excluded. But even the traditional logic had to admit in its scheme what was called modality, namely some degrees of certainty or uncertainty with which a given statement is made. Lately, Lukasiewicz has shown that a three-valued logic can be so formulated as to include modality. Later, he and Tarski generalized it to an n-valued logic. When n tends toward infinity, this logic becomes the logic of probability. If these disciples are made non-elementalistic, we have what I call 1, 2, 3, and infinitely valued general semantics. Theoretically and in practice, we are interested mostly in the 1, 2, 3 few valued and infinitely valued general semantics. For my purpose and for simplicity, I shall deal only with identification, that is, the primitive one-valued semantics, the influence of which is found in both the 2 and 3 valued semantics and may only be completely eliminated in an infinitely valued semantics. We live in a four-dimensional space-time manifold on all levels, consists of absolutely individual events, objects, situations, abstractions. We must conclude that structurally we live in an indefinitely many-valued or infinitely valued world, the possibilities of which follow in principle the laws of combinations of higher orders. The above statement represents a description of a structural observation about the empirical world, independent of our pleasure, and can be contradicted only by exhibiting empirically actual identity or absolute sameness of different events, objects, or situations, which exhibiting becomes an impossibility if we decide to investigate facts more fully. Under such empirical conditions for adjustment and so for sanity, we must have on semantic levels such theories, systems, methods, which would allow us in a given case under given conditions or at a given date to evaluate the individual happenings uniquely, or which would allow us to establish a one-to-one correspondence between the essentially infinitely valued facts of experience and our semantic states. It becomes obvious that this can be accomplished only if we have infinitely valued and non-elementalistic general semantics. We see that the three valued elementalistic Aristotelian logic, psychology, and in general the Aristotelian system, being structurally different from the empirical world, will prevent, in principle, such an adjustment, therefore, sanity. Identification may be considered as the remains of pre-human or primitive or infantile one-valued semantics, which establishes or results from semantic states, by which the essentially infinitely valued facts of experience are not differentiated or evaluated properly, and so the indefinitely many values of these facts are identified into a single value. Such identification is always structurally unjustified and dangerous, and may be the result of a great many factors such as low development, ignorance, insufficient observation, wishful thinking, fears, pathological states of our nervous system, different semantic disturbances, mental ills, infantilism in the grown-ups. But among humans, we cannot avoid training through the mechanism of language and its structure in some, most often unconscious, general semantics, and so a great deal depends on what kind of semantics or methods of evaluation we impose on our children. We should notice an important fact which is usually disregarded, namely that a language, and often one word, involves a definite type of semantics. Thus, in primitive polysynthetic languages, it is not a question of associations or superstitions. The mystic characteristics and the thing simply are not differentiated, but literally identified into one whole. A language of true and false involves two valued semantics. The introduction of adverbs or their equivalents introduces modality, and so three valued semantics. The introduction of indefinitely many degrees between the true and false leads finally to infinitely valued semantics. A diagram may help to make this clear. And there's three figures on the side. Figure 2, A, B, C, etc. are infinitely valued and different facts of experience, which in a given case have by necessity indefinitely many single individual values. A, B, and C, lowercase, infinitely valued, non-Aristotelian orientations, structurally similar to the empirical world, which allows us in a given case to assign indefinitely many single one-to-one corresponding values to the individual facts. In figure 3, A, B, and C, etc. are infinitely valued in different facts of experience, which in a given case have by necessity indefinitely many single individual values. E1, E2, etc. 2, 3, and few valued Aristotelian orientation structurally non-similar to the empirical world, which compels us to ascribe two or a few values to the essentially indefinitely many valued and different facts, resulting in identification of the many values into a few, which in proper evaluation is projected on the facts. A, B, and C, etc. are infinitely valued and different facts of experience, which in a given case have by necessity indefinitely many single individual values. That symbol, one valued, animal, primitive orientation, structurally non-similar to the empirical world, which compels us to ascribe one value to the essentially indefinitely many valued and different facts, resulting in identification of the many values into one, which in proper evaluation is projected on the facts. In figure 2, the arrows, capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b, indicate the non-Aristotelian one-to-one correspondence between the infinitely valued individual facts of life, capital A, B, and C, and the corresponding semantic reactions, or A, B, and C lowercase orientations, which ascribe single values to the different facts, establishing a foundation for structurally correct proper evaluation, which helps adjustment and so sanity. In figure 3, the Aristotelian two few valued orientation and type of correspondence is shown. In figure 3, the horseshoe indicates a single, say, proper evaluation of the one fact A. The arrows, horseshoe, capital B, horseshoe, capital C, horseshoe, capital D, horseshoe, capital E, horseshoe, capital F, and so on to horseshoe, capital N. I hope that's a horseshoe symbol. Indicate the projection of the one valued semantic state or orientation on the essentially unchanged, infinitely valued facts, capital A, B, and C, distorting them. In other words, the infinitely valued facts through the identification of many values into one and by pathological projection have been given wrong evaluation, thereby preventing in principle adjustment and sanity, particularly for a civilized human. 1933. If we train our children in 1, 2, 3, and more generally few valued elementalistic Aristotelian reactions based on corresponding languages, logics, etc., the result may be that they will have great difficulty in adjusting themselves to a world of non-elementalistic, infinitely valued facts. And that even if they succeed, this would ultimately happen only after a great waste of efforts and unnecessary sufferings. If we approach the infinitely valued facts of life with one, two, or even few valued semantic attitudes, we must identify some of the indefinitely many values into one or a few values, and so approach the infinitely valued world with an orientation which projects ignorantly or pathologically or restricted few valued semantic evaluations on the infinitely valued individual facts of experience. The above explanations apply in the fullest extent to the structure of language, the daily language, as well as our attitudes towards it. Still reflects primitive structural semantic reactions of the period before it was known that on the objective levels we deal exclusively with infinitely valued four-dimensional processes. The language in the Aristotelian system represents in principle what may be called a three-dimensional and one, two, etc., more generally few-valued linguistic system, structurally non-similar to the infinitely valued four-dimensional event process conditions. Let us analyze, for instance, the Aristotelian term apple. The term represents in principle a name for a verbal, one-valued, and constant intentional definition in which space-time relations do not enter. What are the structural facts or experience? The object, which we may call apple, represents a process which changes continually. Besides, every single apple that ever existed or will exist was an absolute individual and different from any other objective apple. In applying such a three-dimensional and one-valued language to essentially or infinitely valued processes, we only make proper evaluation, and so adjustment and sanity very difficult. Yet the structural adjustment is simple in a non-Aristotelian system. The Aristotelian apple was a name for a verbal intentional definition. In a non-Aristotelian system, we manufacture indefinitely many names for the indefinitely many objective and different apples by subscripts, apple 1, apple 2, apple 3, supplementing the subscript with the date, thus in apple 1, February 23rd, 1933. We gain the possibility of considering apple NT as infinitely valued, and so in a given case, we are enabled to have a single name which we could relate to single values of the objective absolute individuals and absolute individual stages of the process. Similarly, with multiordinal terms, before the multiordinality of terms was discovered and formulated by me in 1925, these terms were silently assumed in principle to be one-valued, and we were either prevented from using them in connection with the infinitely valued orders of abstractions, or if used by semantic necessity, we identified the indefinitely many valued values into one. Both results were undesirable. The first established semantic blockages to creative scientific work. The other promulgated semantic disturbances. But once the multiordinality of terms is established, we have infinitely valued terms to which in a given context, by differentiating the different orders of abstractions, which a context indicates, we can ascribe single values. Such a pioneering analysis may appear difficult at first, but this is only due to the lack of familiarity and established pre-Aristotelian and Aristotelian 1, 2, 3, or few valued semantic reactions, all of which involve ultimately identification somewhere. Once identification is abolished, however, and there is childishly simple, although not easy and rather laborious for grown-ups, infinitely valued semantics become natural and automatic, evading very serious theoretical difficulties. In the present volume, I had to elaborate in detail upon different issues simply because my readers will be mostly grown-ups and establish pre-Aristotelian and Aristotelian reactions, who must first be made to recognize the benefits of a non-Aristotelian evaluation before they will be willing to undergo a laborious re-education of their older semantic reactions. The procedure in the training of infants and children is extremely simple and entirely on their levels. There is, however, one point that I wish to make entirely clear. From the older point of view, one might say that a non-Aristotelian system may lead to over-rationalization and consequently take all the joys out of life. Such objections are entirely unjustified. First of all, the Aristotelian system leads to shallow but often clever verbal interplay of definitions, mostly non-similar in structure to the world and ourselves, representing a species of apologetics and usually called rationalization. The non-Aristotelian system leads to structural adjustment of language and semantic reactions and a structural inquiry, resulting in understanding. It makes shallow, infantile rationalization, wishful thinking, and apologetics of different brands impossible, but leads to a higher order of adult intelligence based on proper evaluation and mere rationalization. We often have clever but shallow infantile evaluation based on the ignorance or disregard of structural facts, which alone make up the content of the knowledge. In a non-Aristotelian system, by eliminating the sources of infantile evaluation and reactions, we supply the nervous system of the infant with uniquely appropriate material so that it may develop into a normal adult. In the order system, instead of helping, we hindered the development of adult standards of evaluation with well-known results. There is nothing wrong with human nature or the majority of nervous systems as such, but there is something definitely wrong with our educational methods inside and outside our schools. There is another point which is still more convincing and perhaps even more decisive. The above-mentioned older objections are due to semantic reactions based on the play upon elementalistic terms and are a neurological impossibility. The organism works as a whole, and in the cyclic nerve currents, it is impossible by any known educational method to abolish emotions. But what can be accomplished is this: by training in silence on the unspeakable objective levels and in differentiation between different orders of abstractions, we automatically abolish the infantile identifications and evaluations. We introduce a delay in action, which is the physiological means for getting our emotions under control and for engaging the fuller cooperation of the cortex. Infantile over-emotionalism is abolished in the adult. Infants would behave as infants, but this infantile behavior would not be carried into the period when adulthood should begin. The emotions are not abolished, but sublimated. It is true that many standards would be changed. For instance, we might roughly say that an infantile type is often bored by a symphony, and that jazz satisfies his infantile makeup. If we were to take such an infantile grown-up and compel him to listen only to symphonies, this would not be kind, nor would it transform his infantile semantic reaction into adult reactions. But if unhampered by inappropriate semantic and so neurological training, he would be free to develop normally into an adult, and his own preference would be toward a symphony rather than toward primitive throbbings. His enjoyment then would not be diminished, but perhaps made fuller. Similar analysis could be made of all human interests, with the result that the forcing of adult standards on infantile types would remain unkind. But the sad part of it is that, in spite of repressions, impositions, these imposed standards remain largely ineffective and are abandoned as soon as compulsion ends. Not so if by proper semantic education we allow the infant to develop normally into adulthood. The new standards are not imposed, but become his own. We do not then need compulsion from without, because the new standards act from within and become pleasurable and lasting. A similar process is very obvious in the practice of psychotherapy. The standards of evaluation of the patients are usually inappropriate to the conditions of modern life and often clash sharply with the accepted standards. Moralizing without changing by other means his standards of evaluation never accomplishes any satisfactory therapeutic results. Quite the contrary. It often does a great deal of harm. A physician would be very unwise to censure or condemn a symptom, as this would preclude any beneficial results. What physicians usually do is to treat any symptom, no matter how repulsive, with great sympathy and understanding. They do not attempt to change the symptom directly, but by the understanding of its main mechanism, they try to change the patient's standard of evaluation, of which the symptom is only a consequence. If at all successful, and the physician succeeds in changing the inappropriate standards of evaluation, the symptom then automatically disappears. In daily life, we usually attack only the symptoms, disregarding mostly the underlying structural foundations. This method accounts for the doubtful results. Under infantile standards, we apply similar methods to society. Many may want to abolish wars, revolutions, depressions, but they do not investigate structurally deep enough. They attack the symptoms instead of analyzing the structural issues which produce these symptoms. In conclusion, let us notice that the analysis of a semantic mechanism on a printed page requires new terms and the coordination of many details, which at first do not always appear so simple, although once the theoretical side is mastered, the educational application is genuinely simple. Thus, the analysis of the 1, 2, 3, and infinitely valued semantics may appear difficult, yet in practice, it only amounts to imparting through our educational system a semantic flexibility instead of fixity, to acquiring the inclination of starting with observations followed by descriptions, from which we pass to inferences in connection with awareness of these ordered processes. In training, it is enough to abolish identification, and this is easily achieved once we have produced the proper method based on a language of the non-Aristotelian structure. This last actually consists of but a few new simple and common sense terms, the analysis of which helps us to discover a few simple and invariant psychophysiological relations. Thus, identification is eliminated by starting with the ordinal language and method. Once we get the feel of the horizontal and vertical stratification and learn to differentiate between orders of abstractions, identification disappears, since on the objective levels produce a delay, involves the trains the cortex. Our reactions become more and more intelligent in the human sense, and the most important results are reached by the simplest means. The training in visualization and the abolishing of objectification are the first and most important steps for a complete elimination of identification. When this first step is achieved, the rest is comparatively a simple task. But the reader might ask, why should we have to use such unfamiliar and therefore seemingly difficult methods to achieve such obvious results? Do we really need a non-Aristotelian system to achieve the results which even in an Aristotelian system are known to be desirable? The answer is weighty with consequences and should be taken very earnestly. In the Aristotelian system, these desirable results could not be attained generally because the structure of our old languages and the method hampered rather than helped us. New theories, new systems are built precisely with the aim to facilitate adjustment. Those questions which in the older days were supposed to be philosophical, metaphysical, the application of which required a high grade of intelligence, knowledge, etc., to start with, become in the new way simply a problem of the structure of the language we use. All the issues appear closely interrelated. We do not require higher intelligence or higher education to begin with in order to obtain these desirable results, as the results follow automatically from the structure of the language we accept and teach our children. Thus, the older impossibilities are achieved simply and automatically, with the greatest possible efficiency and the most lasting results.